Hi, all. I hope you're doing well through this crisis that the world's seeing. I guess this is one of the potential downsides of globalization is that these diseases now can move quickly all over the world, especially by air travel, and we've seen it in cruise ships. And so it's important that we follow the rules that the government of Canada and the government of Ontario are giving us now to try to isolate ourselves as much as possible. So I'm reporting here from home, and I'm going to walk you through this week's lecture. Market entry strategies, a really important topic for international business. There isn't an assignment for you to complete this week, but the content of this may indeed be on the final exam. These are our learning outcomes. Now, I want you to consider a case of four different companies and how they would enter the Canadian market. So these are foreign companies and how they would enter the Canadian market. Lindemans was an Australian wine producer and is an Australian wine producer. Some of you may have had their products. When they first came to Canada, they were expecting to have perhaps $2 or $3 million worth of sales in their first year. Not very much. So how would they organize themselves to bring products into the country? Could they afford to set up an infrastructure, warehouses, a head office, salespeople, trucks to distribute across the country? I mean, we're a vast country. And clearly they could not do that. And so they had to find a different way. And what they used was wine agents and wholesalers to help them do that. So the wine agents acted as their sales representatives. They received a commission on sales. They never actually took possession of the product. Lindemans, when they received an order from the Control Board of Ontario, or if they received an order from independent grocers in Alberta or in Quebec, they would send the product to wholesalers who would then distribute it to the various retail outlets. So they used something that was called indirect exporting. They used intermediaries to help them selling within the country. And it was much less expensive for them than trying to set up their whole operation in Canada. The downside of it was they had to give a lot of their profit to the partners in Canada. Now, the Subway sandwich chain, we saw it expand very rapidly in Canada in the 1990s. How did they do it? Did they set up shop, build all kinds of stores in Canada in order to do this? No, they didn't. They used a kind of partnership arrangement. They used franchises. And so the franchisees, those who were going to run the sandwich shop often, they would pay a fee to Subway, and then they would continue to pay some fees to Subway for advertising. They'd buy product from the Subway head office, but the individual stores themselves, the cost of that went to the individual franchisees and not to the Subway Corporation. Now, Donald Trump built a tower, or at least had his name on a tower in downtown Toronto. Now, he knows a lot about condo development in New York City, not so much in New Jersey, where he tried to set up a casino and failed, but he knows a lot about New York City. But does he know about condo development in Canada? What do you have to know? You have to have political contacts. You have to know about all of the laws and regulations within Toronto. You have to, of course, have close relationships with many different contractors and subcontractors in the city, and he didn't have that. So what did he do? Well, he ended up working a partnership, strategic partnership with a Canadian condo developer. And for the most part, what Trump provided was the Trump name and whatever prestige went with that would go on the tower. And he also offered management services so that once it was built, part of it was a hotel, and the Trump organization would manage the hotel and the building. In that case, again, he's sharing his profits with the Canadian company, and it can be done in the way of a joint venture, or it can be done in the way of a licensing agreement. Now, Toyota was in a different situation. They were selling a lot of cars in Canada, but they ran up against a limit on the number of cars that they could bring in. We've talked before about tariffs and other kinds of barriers for bringing cars into a country. And in this case, they had a quota. There was only a certain number of cars they could bring in. So how did they work around that? Because there was so much more demand for their cars. They chose direct foreign investment. They built car plants here. They were assembly plants where they would bring components from all over the world, but more than 50% of the value of the car, of the construction, was in Canada, and it therefore met the rules for Canadian manufacturing and also for within the North American Free Trade Agreement at the time. So for Toyota, they used an entry strategy called direct foreign investment. So here they are described here. Exporting, direct or indirect. Direct if you sell directly, for instance, to government, or indirect. And in the case of Lindemans, we saw they used agents and distributors. Think of yourself with the Grey Ape winery that we talked about and had two cases on in the course. This is the approach that they would likely use. They were looking at only building to $500,000 in ice wine sales totally and globally, and so their sales in any country would be small. So they would almost certainly be using agents, potentially distributors, and wholesalers to get the product to the customers. Now you notice on this graph it shows low profit potential, but also low control and low financial risk. So they basically had to hand over their marketing responsibilities to the agents and distributors, and those agents and distributors took a lot of the profit. Contractual agreements, licensing and franchising, so that would be Subway. We're now the Subway Corporation. They give up a certain amount of control within the stores, of course, and the stores are owned by owned and operated by independent managers, franchisees, but they still maintain a decent amount of the profit. In the course of strategic alliances, such as joint ventures or co-marketing arrangements, again, it's an even tighter alliance. And the Trump Corporation likely had a joint venture arrangement like this. And finally, Toyota, with direct foreign investment, created a subsidiary in Canada, and that way they managed to control the marketing, but they take on the financial risk. The result is, though, that they get much more profit. So I'll just briefly go through again. Direct exporting is when you sell business to business or business to government. I used to do that in my business when I sold healthcare products and vaccines. I would sell directly to governments. Indirect exporting is when you use intermediaries, and the wineries are a good example of that. More and more, we're seeing companies develop with internet. It can either be selling directly to customers or selling through someone like Amazon, and that's referred to as affiliate marketing, where Amazon will take a piece of the action as well. A couple of illustrations just to show how that works for consumer products. On the left-hand side, these are, excuse me, I don't think it's COVID, it's just a cough. On the left-hand side, you'll see that you have the manufacturer selling directly to customers in a variety of ways, including internet and mail order. They can use the MSF manufacturer sales force to sell directly to the retailer, or they can use agents and brokers, as we used in the example of the wineries. They can have the manufacturer's sales representatives or sales force sell to wholesalers, and they can also go directly to wholesalers, to retailers and customers. So there's many different ways that you can sell to consumer products into the market, whichever one is most effective. For industrial products, there's a lot more manufacturer direct to the customers, especially when they're high value added products. So if you're selling wind turbines or locomotives, then you would often sell directly to the main customer. And generally that would be through your own sales force. So the second one on the left there, directly to the customer. Sometimes by internet, but if it's going to be directly by internet, it tends to be very standardized products and ones that don't require much service. In some cases, you'll sell a manufacturer to a wholesaler or to a distributor and then through a wholesaler. That's the sort of thing that we see with Fastenal, where they have many different components that are sold to manufacturing firms and warehouse firms. But they're able to bring them together from many manufacturers and offer a full line of products and service. The contractual agreements, again, licensing or franchising. And I think you all have some good understanding of when those are used. Licensing, that's when you license your intellectual property or your brand name to a company. And in the case of franchising, that's when you really develop a whole system like a McDonald's restaurant. Joint ventures are a very specific kind of organization where they create a third distinct organization called the joint venture, and then the partners each own part of that joint venture, own 50% of that joint venture. And there have been many examples of that in history. The Chinese government in particular encourages that for foreign investment so that some of the technology transfer will happen in China. Generally, though, these kinds of arrangements don't work long term. They can work short and medium term, but the different organizations have different strategic plans and different goals ultimately. And so eventually it breaks down, and often one of the partners then buys the other company out. And then there are other forms of strategic alliances, such as the airlines, Star Alliance. They have 27 member airlines. And what they do is they work together on flights. And so if, for instance, Air Canada is flying to Australia and they don't have a direct flight, they may fly to Germany. And in Frankfurt, Lufthansa, the German airline, might fly the rest of the way to Australia. But they'll all go on an Air Canada ticket and they'll earn Air Canada points. So this is quite a complex alliance that's been worked out for those different airlines. And then there's the direct ownership, which can be either by setting up your own subsidiary or by buying another firm. A company has to be able to accept the financial risk and often wait several years before the new operation will be profitable. And you've seen that in many cases where you're setting up your own sales forces in these different Latin American countries with AllSmile. So let's think about a few companies we've looked at. Disney. What did they do when they went to Europe and set up Euro Disney? Well, they used ownership, direct foreign investment, and they had a very high financial risk. They kept complete control, potentially high profit, but in the first years, we know they really lost their fortune. So the financial risk was a big problem for them. Grey Ape Winery, what have they used? They have used, or they would use, indirect exporting, and likely use either a distributor to do all of their management of the sales and marketing in the country, or they might use an agent to do the sales part and then a wholesaler just to ship the product and store it for them. And AllSmile, what have you seen? Well, you've seen a combination, both ownership, where you have your own sales force visiting, and you've done indirect exporting because you've used wholesalers, distributors to get the product out, often to the small stores, the self-serve, and the those type of mom and pop traditional stores in the country. Now, in managing the international distribution, there are advantages and disadvantages. When you're selling through wholesalers, it's often useful in rural countries, very typical if there's many small retailers. The downside is that you aren't dealing directly with the end user, and you're not sure how much support is getting to the retailers, and of course you have to give up part of your profit to the wholesalers. If you sell directly to the retailers, as you had with your sales forces in many cases, There's gains in monitoring and control of the merchandising, the positioning, the brand image, and the contribution margin isn't spread through the various wholesalers. However, it's more costly if there are a lot of retailers to work with, and most of you found that with traditional retailers, that it really wasn't cost effective to try and reach them. And it can also move you into a non-core business. In your case, you were setting up a sales force anyway, but in some cases, it just makes more sense, even in the long term, for companies to continue to use wholesalers, sales agents, distributors. So for you and Country Manager, you had the hypermarkets. They bought big volumes, so you generally had your sales force go directly to them. Self-serve outlets and traditional sellers, for the most part, you worked through distributors, the wholesaler. So they all had different needs. As it mentions here, you used the wholesalers particularly to reach those small retailers. And you all recognize those screens where you had to make the decisions whether you distribute in the channel, how many salespeople you would have, whether you would promote in the channel, and how much that budget was. That was money that would be available to the sales force to help to promote in the local currency. And then you had to decide whether or not you would allocate that money based on the size of the sales force, the total channel sales, or the sales in the last year. International marketing distribution, it's best managed, though, always thinking of it as part of a single coordinated strategy for the whole company. And for most companies, it's important to enlist the services of international shipping and logistics experts. And those experts include freight forwarders. These are the people who manage the distribution of products from one country to another or from one site to another. They're sometimes referred to as forwarding agents. They basically book space on airlines, on ships, in trucks and trains in order to make sure that you get the product to your customer at the lowest possible cost. The way it works really is that they negotiate deals with airlines, for instance, and while it might cost you $5 a kilo to ship something from here to Australia, because they have such huge volumes and so many customers, they can negotiate a price of, say, $2.50 a kilo. So when you go to them and say, I want to send something to Australia through you, they give you a better price. Perhaps you get it for $3.50 instead of $5, and they still make $1 profit. So the freight forwarders, by having these huge volumes and many customers, they manage to negotiate good deals with the airlines or the shipping companies, and they pass on some of that saving to you. The freight forwarders can do more as well, depending on what your needs are. They can prepare commercial invoices, export declarations, bill of lading, all sorts of other documents. Any services that you need, they will be an additional cost. It tends to be that medium and large size companies, they already have people internally who can manage and do all of that paperwork, for instance. But for small companies, it can be a really great service and cost effective. The other important partner are the customs brokers. So they're at the other end. They make sure that your goods get cleared through customs quickly, that they can prepare the documents, electronic submissions, they'll calculate what taxes and duties and excises are, and they'll facilitate communication between you and any government authorities. These were particularly important for us when I was working in the healthcare products. We would send products that were shipped in insulated containers with ice or dry ice. And so they had to be cleared very quickly to get them into refrigerators and freezers, and the customs brokers managed that for us. So a few final thoughts. Your market entry decisions have to be based on a thorough analysis of the needs of each country market. In terms of market coverage, the percentage of the total markets that may be reached through the marketing or sales activities, and in terms of customer support, depending on the kinds of and the nature of the product and the services provided, and the customer expectations, you may need more or less support. So if you're providing equipment for assembly lines in a country, you need to be able to offer service for those lines. For the business that I was in, healthcare, we need to be able to offer 24/7 responses to doctors when there were problems or questions about our products. And finally, you have to look at the cost-benefit analysis for one strategy versus another. Okay, that's it for me today. You can send me questions via email. I'm also available to meet with you to go through your decisions or your strategies for country manager. We'll just have to set up an appointment, send me an email, and we'll find a time that works for us before you finish playing the simulation. Best wishes to you all.